Hello, everybody. Welcome to SoCal Loopers. We have a good day, good program today. We have Dr. Steve Edelman and Dr. Rayhan Lal. This is really cool, and I'm glad you're joining us. They are both type 1 diabetics. They both are endocrinologists. They both loop or have looped or do loop, and they both are Afrezza users, and they're both really bright, and they're really fun to talk to. So we are honored. I will go through the normal disclaimer that we do every single time because we are talking about DIY looping. The Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm and user interface. It's developed through the work of community volunteers. While it may seem obvious, please consult with your healthcare professional regarding your diabetes management. It's important. Please understand that this project is highly experimental and is not FDA approved for therapy. Therefore, you take full responsibility for building and running the system and do so at your own risk. I want to make an introduction, and I'll try to make it short, but these guys are really pretty interesting, pretty wonderful. Dr. Steve Edelman has had type 1 diabetes since the age of 15. He's a native of Southern California. He is a type 1. He is an endocrinologist. He's a clinical professor of medicine. He's a founder of TCOID, which is taking care of your diabetes. He's a looper, and he's a Afrezza user. He's also really funny. Just so you know, because I was impressed as I was reading this, he was valedictorian of his medical school graduating class, so he's not just a pretty face, he's really smart. He's a Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of California Davis School of Medicine, a lot more honors that I could tell you about. After completing his diabetes specialty training at the Joslin Diabetes Center in Boston, he came to the University of California, San Diego, where he's been on staff since 1990. He champions the cause of patient advocacy and has dedicated his life to helping people with diabetes live healthier and happier lives. Okay, and let me tell you about Dr. Rayhan Lal. I just recently met him. This is another powerhouse. He is a native of the East Bay area in California, Northern California, has had type 1 diabetes for 30 years. He studied electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley, and he says, go Bears, with the hope of applying his knowledge to diabetes technology. His younger sisters also developed diabetes, which motivated him to devote his life to advancing the care of diabetes in people of all ages. So, to that end, he is instructor of pediatric endocrinology and diabetes, also instructor of medicine, endocrinology, gerontology, and metabolism. So it's young to old. He covers it all. He's at Stanford University, part of Stanford Healthcare. And we are just so lucky to have both of them here today. And I will let you guys fight for who starts talking first.
Can I say something first?
You can.
Yeah, you know, Rayhan, he's very humble guy, but you know, he developed these software programs. He knows this information better than probably anybody on the line, and he's helped over 900 people get on loop, including me. And I can't understand how he can do it with people texting him at 2 a.m. Rayhan, how come I get this red circle out here? And I don't bug you as much as I used to, Rayhan. And
Not at all.
also an adult and pediatric endocrinologist. So, I mean, I think, and I get credit for recruiting him to be on the show with me because I do not know the intricate IT details of looping, although I love it, and I've been on the Tandem for 4 months, and I came back to looping, and I have some questions for Rayhan later too. But I did want to say thanks, Rayhan, for coming on the show with me, or the program with me. There's no way I could have answered any specific IT, but that's why we make a good pair.
Happy to be here, and I do have a few slides if anyone would be interested. If I probably contain some of the questions that you guys will be asking, but really I want this to be an interactive session, so please pause me during any of it and ask questions. Okay, so let me just share my screen here. All right, can everyone see that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit today about automated insulin delivery because I think we have just so many options now. And if you live in Europe, you have even more options. They have Diabeloop 780G, all sorts of fun stuff. So I do consult for Abbott, BioLink, Capillary Biomedical, Morgan Stanley, and Tidepool. As mentioned, I'm a person with diabetes for the last 30 years. I'm an engineer. My two sisters both have type 1. That's what made me decide to move from engineering over to medicine. And I do adult and pediatric endocrinology. And I've been working in diabetes technology research for the last 5 or 6 years now. So, quick introduction. I think the piece we all know is that rapid changes in technology have allowed us to get closed loop delivery of insulin, and that's automated insulin delivery. So, insulin pumps been around a long time. I think a lot of us on this call can attest to the fact that pumps have been around. So we've had those. They've been capable of doing insulin delivery, and we've been capable of sending them commands for a while now. Controllers, algorithms for keeping something in a tight range, that has existed for a while as well. It hasn't necessarily been directed towards diabetes for a good long time, but they have existed. Really what was the missing piece for a lot of years, you go back to the papers from the 60s and the 70s about this, they talk about closed loop control even then, but they didn't have the continuous glucose monitor piece of this. And maybe Steve can tell us the advances that he has seen over the years here with all this technology.
I'll do that later. You keep going, Rayhan.
Okay. So every U.S. pump manufacturer now has a closed loop option available, be it open source or commercial. I don't differentiate between the two. Each system relies on different rules or algorithms to control the delivery of insulin. Some rely primarily on what you get out of the CGM, while others use models to predict the future. And if you're using models to predict the future, you need to know what somebody's insulin sensitivity factor is. You need to know their carb to insulin ratio. You need to know what they're eating, what's going on in their environment, because all of that information affects where you predict the future glucose is going to. So their settings are quite important. And the designers and or regulators have to balance the interests of glycemic control against safety, right? Because you can have tighter control if you're willing to tolerate more hypoglycemia. They have to balance personalization, right? So most of the commercial products, they're trying to hit the John every person with diabetes, right? So they're trying to make a product that will work for the greatest number of people, but the tails of the bell curve may be excluded. You want to make, yes.
Oh, just sorry to interrupt. On that second bullet point, you say some rely primarily on CGM while others use models to predict the future. So where does the Tandem fit there? Because they rely on the CGM, but also the predicted glucose in 30 minutes. So is that they use both?
Correct. So they are mainly a model-based control system. We're going to talk about specifically that system in a moment here. Now, that doesn't mean that the ones that use models do not rely on CGM data, because every one of these systems needs CGM data. It's just that some are exclusively dependent on CGM and do very little modeling behind the scenes, while some do more modeling and also are using the CGM data as well. And you'll find what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about 3 basic control strategies, but what you'll find is a lot of the actual commercial systems blend together various flavors of each of these to make it into a fairly competitive system. So again, there are these balances that have to occur. You know, adaptation is a big one, right? Do you do short-term adaptation, medium-term adaptation, long-term adaptation? These are very important questions when you're thinking about how does a system evolve. The other thing that is especially true in Silicon Valley, where I practice, is that people have really different goals, right? So some people manage diabetes as if it's setting the high score in a video game. Others just want to live their life without complications so they can do what they actually want to be doing, which is not worrying about the diabetes. I have always practiced the latter of those two strategies. So I know people oftentimes will say, well, it's a better time and range, must be better, right? Not always, not always. So the best controlled participant in the diabetes control and complications trial was in the 70-ish% time and range zone. That was the best. And that was with a team of doctors, supremely involved intervention. And that was the best they got. And those folks did not progress to complications over the study period. And even more telling, the average time in range for people who did not develop retinopathy or microalbuminuria was only 44 plus or minus 15%. So in other words, we have consensus criteria for a time in range around 70%. And it is okay to be in that 70%-ish time in range. You will not get severe microvascular complications living at 70% time in range. The other thing to keep in mind is that the tighter your control gets, one of the issues becomes that you are over-insulinizing the system. And if you're having a normal carbohydrate diet, if you are having lows at the cost of tighter control, you'll get weight gain. If you have a 10% increase in body weight, you have probably undone a lot of the glycemic benefit from dropping your A1C, even a percentage point. So you have to really balance the weight gain, the hyperinsulinization against this time in range in order to really achieve a reasonable outcome. So if you can get to 98% time in range and not have tremendous weight gain, fabulous. But if you've gained 20 pounds to get there, then that is just putting your cardiovascular risk from glycemia into adiposity.
So let's... Can I add in something?
Absolutely, Steve.
Rayhan and I work closely with Jeremy Pettis, who you should get as one of your guests one day. And he's got type 1. He's a looper. He's now on Tandem. But his area of research is, believe it or not, hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. Hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, and increasing chances for heart disease. So we always talk about that in type 2 diabetes, but I make this comment at this point because of the unphysiologic nature that we give ourselves insulin, as type 1s, in the subcutaneous tissue. It doesn't get absorbed in the hepatic vein before it goes into the circulation like insulin does from the pancreas in healthy people, and where there's 50% extraction. So us type 1s, we have what we call peripheral hyperinsulinemia because we give insulin in such a non-physiologic manner. So I think in general, using the least amount of insulin possible to get the desired effect is probably a good thing. And in the future, we'll probably have different types of insulin. Go back to the implantable insulin pump that delivers insulin into the peritoneal space. If you guys remember the one that Medtronic made many years ago. So yeah, it's a big thing in type 1s as well as type 2s. Oh, I've seen this controller, Rayhan. It was you spoke about it at the conference. It looks like my TV, the design of my TV remote.
So Steve, no, excellent points by Steve. And I want to also impress upon you that yes, this is not physiologic insulin delivery. In fact, there is a company, Physiologic Devices, that is working on an intraperitoneal pump, and that's where some of my research is. because of this hyperinsulinization that tends to occur with subcutaneous delivery. And it is something, unfortunately, the mere fact that you have type 1 does not mean that you cannot develop insulin resistance and type 2 features. And like I said, there is this balance. So let's talk about control systems a little bit from the engineer's perspective, okay? Because I know it sometimes is a little boring, but I'm gonna go over this. So a PID controller takes your CGM glucose, and let's say your CGM glucose maybe is looking like this, okay? And you put in here a target glucose. So let's say, your target glucose is something like this, and your CGM glucose looks something like that. So what you have here is now an error function where you subtract what your current glucose is from your target glucose. And if we look at that graph, that may look like this, where we've just shifted now everything by this target glucose. So this is how far away we are from where we want our glucose to be. And so there is one point in this curve where we're exactly at the target glucose, but most of it is spent away from the target glucose. So now how do we design a controller that uses this information to change the amount of insulin we're getting? Well, at any given point of time, we'll say there's a point in time t, we do three things to this error function. First, we take a proportionate term, and that proportionate term is just how far away are we, and that becomes the proportionate term. Then we take the integral of this term, which is the area under the curve leading up to that point in time. That's the integral term. And then we take the rate of change at that point in time. So if you imagine a line going through there, that's the rate of change. So that's the derivative term. And apologies for the tight chicken scratch there, but effectively, you now have a P, an I, and a D term based purely on the glucose value that has been coming in. And you add those up, each has a multiplier, which we say is Kp, Ki, Kd, and those get multiplied by the proportional term, the integral term, and the derivative term added together, and you come up with something that is an insulin change. Now, this is at the heart of how the 670 system works. They've made many implementation decisions here that we don't necessarily know about. So for example, the proportionate term we know is going to be this difference, but the term, the Kp term, that is where they're doing their tuning. The Ki, the Kd, how often do they tune those parameters is how often your system sort of adapts. So in that system, they frequently choose this 48-hour metric. The other term is the integral and derivative term. And for those, you need to say over what period of time am I taking the integral, over what period of time am I taking the derivative. Again, those are not things that are made aware to the user. The only additional thing that they throw in is they do throw in an insulin on board exponential curve, which is kind of like the ones you see in Loop, where you have a curve of insulin activity. That is not the same as the active insulin time on those pumps. Okay. And then there's this other thing called fuzzy logic. Usually in the past, this has been a bunch of experts get together in a room and they say, under these sort of conditions, we're going to decide what to do with insulin delivery. So here's a very simplistic version of one of those. So they look at, in this implementation, they look at the blood sugar level. They say, okay, the blood sugar is either L for low, N for normal, H for high, VH for very high, or VVH for very, very high. And that's where the fuzziness comes in. They're not using exact numbers here. They're just sort of fuzzifying the data coming in. Then they look at the blood sugar rate of change, and they make that very negative, negative, zero, positive, or very positive. And then the acceleration, which is the second derivative, and that can be negative, zero, or positive. And then they say in each of those different combinations, I'm going to alter insulin delivery by this much. This is a very simplistic way of thinking about it. It's not super complex, but that's effectively what fuzzy logic is. It's rules to decide how much insulin to change things by. And people have used a lot more fancy strategies to get at what rules they should use, but that's another method of control. And the last one, which we'll talk about at some length, is predictive control. So in these situations, you predict the future glucose, and then you alter the insulin delivery to get it into whatever range you set. And what is one of the best examples of a model predictive controller? Well, Luke does a really, it really is the very picture of model predictive control. So what do? They model the active insulin, and the way they do this is, right, you have your insulin activity graph, which has some exponential decay function to model the insulin. And at any given point in time, you can say how much insulin is left from these impulse deliveries under insulin delivery. Then you have active carbohydrates, and you specify how many carbohydrates there are, how long the duration is, and at any given point in time, they tell you what that carbohydrate effect is going to have over time on your blood sugar. Now, how do they do the blood sugar impact of this? Well, for active insulin, it's just sort of this insulin quantity times ISF, and that's how much the insulin is going to drop you. And the active carbohydrates, they take whatever carbs you enter and divide it by your carb to insulin ratio. So whatever carbs exist at a given point in time t, they divide it by that carb to insulin ratio, which will give you the number of units. And then they multiply that quantity by ISF, and that is what tells you how much that carb quantity is going to change your glucose. So you have the positive effect of the carbs, the negative effect of the insulin, and then in addition, they use two forms of short-term adaptation there. There is retrospective correction, which basically says, if the model was wrong, the next prediction, I'm going to add in whatever that error was. So if, in other words, if you were expected to be 120, but you were actually 100, then the next prediction, it will take off a little bit to try to get the prediction to be more accurate. And then glucose momentum, which basically says a rising blood sugar is going to continue to rise. And as it turns out, Dexcom also implements something like that in their sensor actually to improve the accuracy. Now, do those things exist in actual physiology? Not necessarily, but they are little kludges you can throw in to improve performance a little bit. So I want to stop there because I'm sure there are some accumulated questions on all these control strategies. And we'll next talk about sort of how do the commercial systems use these strategies. Well,
I'm actually curious. Sorry about that. I'm actually kind of curious which of these does model what would happen in a like inside your body if we had not worthless pancreas, whatever that is. Like which of these models kind of most accurately represents what would actually happen in your body?
It's a good question, Wyatt. So this is a situation where PID control is one of those things that, you know, we've been using in industrial control processes for a long time. This is where I want something to be. This is where it is right now. And however far away I am from achieving my goal, I'm going to turn up the gain or turn down the gain on the system to achieve that goal. So that has no bearing in physiology, but has plenty of practice and use in industrial control processes. Fuzzy logic, depending on how you establish your rules, may have some reflection of physiology, or it might just be, you know, a machine learning strategy that has taken all of these inputs together and figured out a way to get the output that you want. You can tie together any logic, put it in a fuzzy logic system to make it do what you want it to do. Model predictive control is the only place where we actually try to model future behavior and then make actions based on that future model. So that does sort of follow the physiology. And people have been trying to understand the physiology of glucose dynamics for a long time. There's something called the minimal model that is frequently used to describe glucose absorption and physiology. And that is used in some of these other systems sort of to decide how much insulin and glucose is on board and make an approximation. So in that sense, model predictive control is the one that sort of models physiology. The problem is, if we could model physiology 100%, then this would be an easy, no problem challenge, right? But because we are creatures of evolution, we are just the sum product of, billions of years of iterations and selecting for which one works the best. We don't follow nice mathematical rules all the time in terms of how our bodies respond to things. So it's hard to predict the future always. And we will actually cover that in another section when predictions are tough.
Rayhan, you had mentioned about modeling, and there are different modeling models. Are they specific to different populations?
So this is a good question. So let's say you wanted to design a system for the every person, okay? You might say, let me go find a paper out there that tells me what somebody's carb ratio is, what their sensitivity is, and what their basal is based on some factor that you can know. So for example, your total daily dose, your weight, something like that. And that's what a lot of the commercial systems have done, is they use the published equations that work for the average person with diabetes, with type 1 diabetes, and that is not always applicable to everybody. And we'll talk about that in this commercial systems section. Let's go into that in the interest of time here. So 670G was a PID with an internal model of insulin on board. So basically they're using effectively this CGM-centered approach, but they also have an insulin on board component to keep track of how much insulin has been delivered and is in the system. Now you'll notice on the upside down display there that active insulin is 0.1 units. That is not the internal model of insulin on board. So they hold on to a quantity of insulin on board that is not displayed to the user. And this was the first commercially developed a closed loop in September 2016. It's one of those things where they had several different algorithms they were thinking about. This one was fairly straightforward to implement, and it got the job done. So what have they learned since that time? So now we are at the 780G stage. Some of the time it is using PID with insulin on board, but other times it's using this licensed fuzzy logic controller from DreamMed for auto boluses. And this is unique from DreamMed's commercial product, which is basically a dosage advisor tool. So they've added fuzzy logic, they've added modeling of insulin, and on top of a PID controller. So in other words, this system has now taken from every one of those 3 control strategies that I have described to put this whole thing together. And you'll find that there are more and more blends as we go on. So, Medtronic is moving things forward in this respect. They're thinking about combined CGM infusion sets. They're working on extended wear infusion sets and CGM. And of course, the big elephant in the room is getting rid of those calibrations. So work is progressing, and they are partnering with Tide Pool for a variant of Loop on their Bluetooth pumps, one of which has been approved in the US, the 770, which is running the old algorithm. So how about Tandem? So Basal IQ received FDA approval in June 2018. It is based on estimating glucose from CGM data alone. Sorry, Steve, did you?
You know what? I'm sorry, I was talking to you with it muted. If you can go back to the Medtronic picture.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen Medtronic, their developments through the years, but to be quite frank, I don't prescribe the 670G, and I've had so many complaints from so many patients. Besides not having Bluetooth, it's the constant need to calibrate, as you mentioned, to stay in auto mode, and they're just not happy with the sensor. So I think it's quite interesting that they don't have the I designation, yet their pumps are allowed to give insulin. I tell you what, to be honest, I don't believe any of these advancements until I see it out in the real world, because people are not happy with the systems. So I do hope the new ones are better. I give them credit for trying to advance their technology, but is their sensor the same sensor?
So they are actively working on a sensor which they're hoping will be available by the 780 product release in the US, which would have many fewer calibrations. I'm still unclear on how many fewer, but it's thought to not even be daily. But there may still be calibration requirements. So from a usability standpoint, the sensor, as you have alluded to, makes or breaks the system, right? If you have a sensor that you either cannot trust or it requires too much work to use, then people are not going to have a good experience with the system. And so that's really where Medtronic and there are many startup CGM companies who think they can come to market with requiring calibrations. And the fact is, now the cat's out of the bag. We have no calibration systems, and I think anyone who has used one of those, they're not going to want to go back to calibrations if they even remember where their meter is.
Yeah. Does anybody in the group here use or has used the 670G and have a different opinion than mine?
It's not that we've heard of. If there's anyone out there who's either tried it or is using it, please just throw it in the chat, and we'll bring you in to talk.
I mean,
nothing to say. If you have gotten good outcomes on any system, there's nothing wrong. My sisters, who I went into medicine for, both are still using either finger sticks and shots or CGM and shots. So it's different strokes for different folks. People have every which way of managing, and I think there are many ways one can manage diabetes.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing. I think as a user, we all realize if we just sit still and we don't eat, we don't exercise, if our basal rate's close, we're going to have really good results. But to me, a good hybrid closed loop doesn't cause you to get low during exercise, and you have less rebound highs. And that may be all timing of insulin. But I find that, and I think many of you would agree, that exercise is a tough time. So that how do you exercise without bottoming out? And that is so frustrating. So, and that's the problem I have with the Tandem system when I used it. But anyway, go on, Rayhan.
No, I totally hear you, Steve. Yes, if we operated like machines, there would be no problem, right? You know, you just sit in a room at your basal metabolic rate, there'd be no issue with the control strategy. You could implement the silliest strategy in existence and it would work just fine. The trick is dealing with the fact that we eat different meals. We don't all eat cardboard. You know, we want to exercise. And going back to our point about cardiovascular health, right? A lot of people will exercise with the objective that, hey, I want to lose some weight. But if you exercise and you go low and you have to eat 15 grams, you've now increased your calorie count by about 60 calories. So every time that you're eating, you're sort of undoing some of the calorie burning that you were doing before. So it's super crucial for your overall cardiovascular health to be able to exercise safely. So that's an absolutely very salient point. So basal IQ was basically initially just using a Kalman filter to estimate future glucose from CGM data alone. Control IQ, which received approval in December 2019 and is just selling like hotcakes around the world, it estimates the glucose and insulin in the body using available pump data and then compares it to an internal model of what it thinks the predicted future looks like. The internal model that they uses parameters for basal, carb ratio, and ISF that are derived from your total daily dose and not your profile settings. So every day or so, it's getting data about how much your total daily usage is. And then it uses sort of the traditional equations that you may see online for each of the parameters. But the problem is those parameters are not just some multiplier of your TDD. So people who are very low carb or very high carb, that has an influence on the amount of basal you're getting. It influences the basal equations and it influences the carb ratio equations. People who are in honeymoon, remember that all of this relies on the fact that their model of physiology says that there is no insulin coming into a type 1 body from anything outside of the pump. So if you make the assumption that all insulin must be coming from your pump, these systems work reasonably. But let's say you take a puff of Afrezza, or let's say that you are in honeymoon and you're still making some of your own insulin, or you just took a subcutaneous shot of insulin. Well, these systems that predict the future cannot predict the future on something they are unaware of. So if they don't know about the insulin, they can't necessarily handle it. And this is another important factor. People with organ dysfunction, so if your kidneys are weak for whatever reason, then you may have reduced clearance of insulin. If you have cystic fibrosis, then you have carb ratios which are generally pretty strong, but then basal and sensitivity factors which are relatively weak. So those standard equations don't apply there. And then other forms of diabetes may follow similar patterns, and gestational diabetes, you may have equations which differ. So anytime the equations are different from the ones posted online, these systems don't work so well. So if you're the average person, then all is well. If you look like me or Steve, you probably do okay on these systems. But if you are on the outer edges, you're not the traditional type 1 person who meets the equations explicitly, that's where things like Loop can be super helpful, right? Because there, the ISF, the ICR, the basal is what you enter. It's not something that's calculated in the background. And that's a really important point, is that for the personalization by the person with diabetes and by the provider, it's super important that you be able to tune the knobs a little bit. And then Insulet, they are making another model predictive control type system. In fact, Horizon is the name of that system, and they do that because prediction horizon is a term in model predictive control to describe how far into the future you're looking. So horizon reflects that prediction horizon. And it will be the first pump to support tight pull loop. It'll be Bluetooth. A lot of the open source loop community is, of course, using pods these days, and with a real uptick in the number of users since that release. So now let's talk about when predictions are tough. I'll pause 1 second for questions if there are any.
Yeah, Rayhan, I had a question about the outliers that are young or old, as I'm edging into the old. How different are we than the middle of the road, the average?
It's a great question. So I will say that probably elderly is less of a concern than actually the toddler age group. So once you get into the really young kids, things start to get really wacky in a hurry. And things like their body composition makes a huge difference. You really have to start to account for the fact that children and toddlers are not simply small adults. Their physiology is slightly different. When you get to the elderly group, one of the questions is this because there is something inherently different, or is it simply because other things are starting to happen? Like, let's say, thyroid function's going down a little bit. You're not secreting as many sex steroids as you once were. You aren't having the same kidney function maybe as you were before. So all of those things may be covariates that we don't necessarily take into account. But one of the main reasons that I am so grateful to anyone who participated in the loop observational study is I am taking all of that study from the loop observational and trying to make equations that factor in things like carbs, things like BMI, total daily dose, so that we actually do have a good starting point for the majority of people. And those equations are not going to be just some multiplier of the total daily dose. And we're hoping to get that out in the next couple months.
How young do you define very young?
Well, I will say that, we talk about person years in the loop observational study. As you go out to the tails, the number of person years becomes less and less. So in other words, yeah, there are fewer people who were 2 years old when they supplied us data. One of the other challenges is some of those folks were on diluted insulin. And so then you have to sort of know that they were on diluted insulin and compensate for that. So you do start to see some outliers as you move in that direction. But certainly, people who are 4 and up, there is more data on, and most of the labeling for these things is 6 or 7 years and greater.
So when you talk about older diabetics, are you talking about how many years as a diabetic, and then secondly, how old?
This is a great question. I think both factors actually play a role here. So on the one hand, people just by virtue of their age. So for example, if you are postmenopausal, you're going to have a different hormonal profile than when you are having periods. And it is important to realize that estrogen and progesterone all have significant effects on your level of insulin resistance. This is why some people have custom overrides for periods. So that certainly plays a role, and that's just regular human physiology. You have to remember that the people who were diagnosed before DCCT, and that was only 92, 93-ish, right? They didn't actually have the data to say that, high blood sugar caused problems. There were a lot of clinicians back in those days who used to live by the statement, run them high, because they were worried about the low blood sugars. So one of the covariates that gets introduced is the older population who lived pre-DCCT, who've had diabetes longer than that period, they may have, as a result of not knowing, a few more complications, and this can include some of the kidney issues. So if the kidney issues are there, then you get into altered insulin pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics, which does change how things work. So it's kind of both at this stage.
So basically, people in their 50s are elderly in like the diabetic world as you're describing it.
It's in the sense that if you're in your 50s and postmenopausal, then you definitely have some change in those hormonal variations. But if you were 50 and diagnosed when you were, say, 35, then I'm not really worried about the kidney issues or necessarily the gastroparesis or anything like that. Whereas if you were 50 and you were diagnosed when you were 2, then maybe some of those also enter into the equations. So you kind of have to know who you're dealing with. And again, none of these commercial systems necessarily allow you to take those factors into account. If you have kidney insufficiency, if your kidneys aren't operating 100%, you can actually alter your insulin absorption profile in loop, create a custom insulin curve that works just for you if you want it to. So there are a lot of adjustments and tweaks that can be made when something is open source, but when it's all hidden behind a layer of intellectual property, can't do it anymore.
That
I have
actually
a
leads
question.
into-
Whoops.
Oh, sorry, just real quick. That actually leads into a question that I had, and not to throw buzzwords out, but with everybody's physiology being different, at what point are we going to start looking at something like taking a couple months of Night Scout or Type Pool, feeding that into a machine learning system or an AI system, and having that look and then carving out your own personal, hey, this is what it looks like for you, and start implementing that?
Right, that's a phenomenal question. Lots of people are talking about digital clones now. So in other words, doing exactly what you suggest, which is taking all this past data and building a virtual copy of yourself, not Black Mirror style, if anyone's seen that show, but just just in the sense of your settings. Now, there are some issues that come up when you start talking about digital copies here. A couple of them have to do with the fact that we don't maintain complete records of everyone, right? So, you might have eaten something, not announced the carbs, and perhaps that got taken as, hey, that was an error of the controller, when really it was missing information. So unfortunately, we would need a lot of ground truth in order to really duplicate the individual. Now, can you use what we know from the loop observational study to at least get the equations a little bit closer to reality? Absolutely you can, and we're going to do that. Can you then take stuff from tide pool loop, throw in a little machine learning for the individual, and maybe make things a little better for them? It's a hope. It's certainly a hope, and it's something that they're hoping with this rapidly iterative process that we can make real. But the other thing that I want to say is that for the vast majority of people that I've started, I can get 70% time in range without doing too much heavy lifting if I just get one good basal, one good carb ratio, one good sensitivity factor, and there is a good entry of information. We can usually get about 70% time in range. So for a lot of folks, we're already at good enough. It's still one of those things where, yes, if you don't want to announce your meals, you might have to live with a slightly lower time in range. if you want to exercise without announcing it, you may have to put up with some lows. But even in the time that I've had diabetes, things have the step size to get to where you want to be has become so much smaller, as has the dietary discipline, for better or worse.
There have been a couple of questions. I want to jump in here on ISF. And the question is, it seems that ISF is the most critical factor in loop. Are there any studies on how ISF changes over a day, over 24 hours? And then how does it change during sleep?
Excellent point. Excellent point. So yes, but methodologically, the way that they have derived this in papers has been very contentious, to say the least, because think of it this way, right? How do I come up with what a good ISF is? Now, in theory, the best way to do this would be to get my basal rate exactly flat, and then I take my blood sugar, get it to a steady state of, say, 200 or so, and then I give a unit of insulin, I wait the full duration of insulin action, and then I come up with how much that delta was. Is anyone going to actually sit down the 6 hours to do that? It's really hard to get somebody to do that. And the other problem is, now you're asking, can I get somebody to do that not just at one time point, but I want that for morning, evening, afternoon? It's just so difficult. So whenever people publish papers on this, I have seen everything from ISF varies by 1.05 times its magnitude over a day to ISF varies by 2 or 3 times its value during a day. So the problem is that because nobody has the right methodology, people come to different conclusions about it. And that's not to say that anyone is right or wrong. What we can say is that cortisol levels are much, much lower at night, almost approaching 0. So you are going to be less insulin resistant in the night. And what we can say is that they peak in the morning. So you are going to be a little more insulin resistant in the morning. Now, is loop adaptable enough that it can compensate for that? In a lot of people, if you get the ISF close enough, it is. But it is important to know that if you are experiencing very particular patterns in the mornings, then it makes sense to perhaps increase the aggressiveness in the mornings, or vice versa, weaken them in the middle of the night if needed.
Hi, Rayhan. This is Diana. I have a few questions. I have not done pumping. I don't even have a CGM. I'm still trying to get those. I'm now on Medi-Cal because I have some disabilities. But there's some words you use I didn't understand. All this is new to me, but it's very interesting. So ISF is like insulin sensitivity factor. Is that right?
Correct. So that is how many points, how many milligrams per deciliter.
I've had diabetes more than 40 years, so I'm familiar with the idea. So that's all right. Okay,
so how many points does 1 unit drop the blood sugar? And that's a sort of crucial number because you use it to figure out what the effect of the insulin is going to be in loop, but also it comes into play in what effect the carbs are going to have when you're dealing with loop. That's why a lot of people consider that to be one of the most important settings.
Okay, which is why I agree with some type 1 posting about they feel that newly diagnosed diabetics, and particularly I've seen parents write on JDRF type 1 blog, they're like thrown for a loop, excuse the analogy, because their kids are diagnosed and they're very young and the parents are given a CGM and an insulin pump and they're overwhelmed. And one guy there who's I think he's had type 1 60 years says, I think it's good for people to learn initially what their body does, just use regular insulin and maybe a CGM to watch how their body actually reacts. So they're familiar with that when the pump goes awry, or you know what I mean? So they're not freaking out, I think, anyway. So
I totally hear you, and you know, this is a big question in the field right now. Should everybody at the diagnosis just have a pump and sensor slapped on? So I will tell you the technical aspect that I would worry about a little bit is this honeymoon period, right? So during that period, you do need, reasonably, in most cases, people do need mealtime coverage. So their carb ratio might be, you know, a reasonable carb ratio. But when they are not, when they are asleep, they may be making enough insulin that they don't necessarily need a heck of a lot of basal. But the system has no idea how much insulin the person who's newly diagnosed is making. So it might artificially reduce the amount of insulin that is needed at meals because it's seeing a low total daily dose due to the decreased needs overnight. So closed loop, a lot of the time, makes the assumption that there is not any endogenous insulin. There's no other insulin except what the system is giving. You bring up CGM, and I will talk about CGM in newly diagnosed folks, because I think most everybody on this call is probably going to be like, yeah, CGM is great. Imagine putting yourself in the position of a parent who has a child who was diagnosed the day before. Now you're seeing that every time they eat, they're going up into the 200s, and it does come back down, but they're like, well, they told me this was the normal range, and this is not the normal range, so I must be doing something wrong. Then they wake up in the middle of the night to low alarms because they were told, set your low alarm at 70, and the kid is sitting at 69 because their own endogenous insulin brought them back to their set point, which is probably somewhere in the high 60s overnight. The kid is entirely asymptomatic because it is a physiologically normal blood sugar for them. But because there is an alarm, they feel that the only thing that saved their child's life was wearing that Dexcom overnight. So you have to keep in mind that with all of these technologies, you need significant education at every step, because otherwise you induce this addictive sort of behavior with the CGM where a parent feels like if the child was not wearing the CGM, their child's going to die overnight. And that obviously is not the case coming from all of us here who slept many nights without a CGM. Okay, guys. So really quickly here, when are predictions tough? Again, I'm going right back to the question that was asked about honeymoon period. So initially, you know, we have this autoimmune destruction of the beta cells. The glucose starts to rise a little bit. We get oxidative stresses that occur as the blood sugar rises. So once you get to 300 or 400 and above, you get this concept of glucose toxicity, and that actually knocks out the beta cell function. That results in a zero insulin state. So even if you have 3 to 4% of beta cells left, they can't push out any insulin because they're surrounded by all this glucose. That's why you get DKA at diagnosis. So we start insulin therapy, we remove that glucose toxicity, and then whatever beta cells remain start producing some insulin again. This is the honeymoon period. The amount of insulin that is produced is a function of how many beta cells you have left and how much each one of those can produce. But we can't model that, or we don't have a great way of modeling that. So because these are sort of in constant flux and dependent on the outside glucose, it's very difficult to model and figure out what is happening during this period. there's often inadequate insulin secretion overnight. There's often adequate insulin secretion overnight when there's no food intake, low levels of cortisol that increase glucose. And so it's hard to compensate when you don't know about insulin. And, it also all seems so simple that, yes, we have insulins and we, all of us have seen in the books how fast regular was versus how fast Humalog, Novolog was versus Afrezza. And it all looks so simple, right? It's like, okay, I inject this in my body and I'm going to look like one of these curves. There was one study that came from the bionic pancreas group way back when, where they took people who were injected with fast-acting insulin, and you'll notice that these are two different participants, and this is the same participant, okay? And in one case, the insulin absorbed much, much slower. And what that means is their curve does not look like the population curve. And so as it turns out, your insulin curve may not look like what everyone else's looks like. It probably is exponential, but to really assess it, you would sort of have to measure insulin levels every couple minutes to figure out how insulin absorbs in you. And that's sort of a challenging thing for most of us. And unfortunately, this wasn't in the data, but the same person can have curves that look different for different body locations, different levels of lipohypertrophy, etc. And as if anyone's ever had this happen, we all assume in these algorithms that what we deliver goes into our body. But there are adults who, for whatever reason, have leaks. And a lot of the time, this is because if you transition from the peds world to the adult world, you might have been on the 6mm cannulas. And for some adults, those are too short. So you get leak back. So if your system is having problems, you might have an infusion set issue. And the system can't possibly model this because it doesn't know enough about what's happening in the outside world. Also to keep in mind that we measure glucose in the interstitial space. This is just the space that exists between our cells. And it takes time for glucose to equilibrate between the blood and the interstitial space. So here is a case where somebody injected IV glucose, and in the IA curves, that's intra-arterial, they measured the quantity of glucose. Notice you see a very rapid spike because, of course, if you directly infuse glucose into the bloodstream, you would want to see the glucose went up when I injected it. If you do an intravenous catheter, it's similar. It goes up very fast and then goes down. If you do intraperitoneal, it's slower, so you get more of an attenuation of that spike, but you still see a spike close-ish to the beginning of the infusion. But look at subcutaneous and interstitial sensing. See how much slower that is. So even though you directly injected glucose into the bloodstream, you don't see anywhere near the spiking until 15 minutes or so. So it is important to realize that there are limitations of where we sense the glucose currently. And of course, everybody employs mathematical tricks to try to get past this. Dexcom does it, Abbott does it, but it is important to realize those are just tricks and they may not always work in all cases. The other thing is, when we talk about sensor accuracy, one other game that is played is regulators say we want to make sure the data reported is accurate, but they don't enforce exactly how much data needs to be reported. They just say no clinically significant gaps, but they never say what clinically significant gaps means. So if you don't trust the glucose value that's coming in, you can blank it. And here's an example where there's a sensor error when somebody's falling rapidly. It's been blanked because they don't believe that you can fall that fast. That could be a dangerous situation, but you're not getting glucose data in that situation because it protects the MARD of the device. So keep in mind that safety does not necessarily imply accuracy, and accuracy does not necessarily imply safety. We wish it did. ISF, yes, it definitely does vary. We have people who are very resistant, very sensitive. The classic equations, people vary between 1,500 to 1,900, maybe even 2,000 looking at the observational data. And it does vary based on body weight. You know, if you've had significant trauma, infections, steroid use, you're going to be more resistant. If you have very low body weight, if you have renal failure, you might be a little more sensitive. Or if you're uremic, you'll actually be more insulin resistant. That's a talk for another day. But what can change your ISF? Slew of hormones: cortisol, epinephrine, growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, glucagon. Your age, puberty does it because you secrete more sex steroids and more growth hormone. Your body composition, two people weighing the same, if one is more fat than lean and one is more lean than fat, they'll have different insulin sensitivities. Blood sugar, so people do find that at higher blood sugars, you might be more insulin resistant. Illness and stress, because they increase some of these stress markers, medications, exercise, all can change your ISF. And activity. So the problem with activity is, yes, can I get an accelerometer on my watch? Absolutely I can. But high intensity interval training is very different from cycling, is very different from walking, is very different from running. And with some exercise, you can actually have a spike in glucose level, high intensity, short duration, whereas low intensity, long duration, or combinations can either cause you to fluctuate or drop low. So just getting accelerometer tracings is not enough. And this is why it's very difficult to do exercise well with closed loop systems. So we have more choices than ever. We don't have a perfect system. So until we do, we need to know where the weaknesses and strengths of all these systems are. When you make a commercial system, it often requires difficult decisions by the designers and regulators. I don't want to shortchange the accomplishments that these guys have made because a lot of work, a lot of study went into these devices. But open source systems offer unparalleled transparency and personalization. So with that, I want to leave plenty of time here for questions. And thanks to Stanford and my mentor, Dr. Bruce Buckingham, a couple references. And my equations won't be this complex, but you will have an exponential or two in there.
Thank you, Rayhan. And by the way, Bruce Buckingham will be on in 2 weeks, kind of as a follow-up to what you've done. There's a couple of questions here. You mentioned Afrezza. That's from Alicia. I would like to try taking Afrezza to help with post-meal spikes, but have been hesitant since I use Loop with my Omnipod. How do you account for it? How do you do that?
That's a great question. So,
like this.
Two ways. So where you will run into problems is if you have a high BG and you're using Afrezza to correct for that, because then the system suddenly says, whoa, where did this drop in blood sugar come from? I didn't cause that. So you must somehow have become very insulin sensitive. And then its next prediction is going to be that you're going to go even further down. And so it will take back its own insulin delivery in that situation, which is probably the last thing you want it to do when your blood sugar is high. Now, if you want to use it in sort of the streamlined approach, you don't announce your carbs to the system. You take the Afrezza and you try to sort of get that to hit an equilibrium. And then if there are slight spikes or falls after that, loop picks up the slack. Now, there are some PRs on loop where we do have feature requests to add the ability to add outside insulin with custom curves into the system. That actually does exist and could be used, but the way traditionally people have done it is to just try their best to cover their meals and then let loop handle the rest. And sometimes if you aren't able to handle all of the carbs, you might put the difference in for whatever's left, especially if there's a slow acting component.
Hey, Rayhan, I've been using Afrezza with my loop and my Omnipod, and to the average lay person that doesn't know much about these formulas, it seems to work just fine. I mean, I've been I use it to improve my time in range. You know, I got Afrezza, and I pretty much use it solely to correct. And you told me you were going to write a program so we can put in Afrezza when we're taking it, and you haven't done it yet. You said you were going to do it over the weekend in between your new, playing with your newborn son, Kieran.
I promise, Steve. We have it, and we can do it. It's one of those things where there are cases where it may in fact do the trick, particularly if it's enough to push things down. But you want to just be very aware that the system may try to fight you back if it's pushing you down too far, too fast.
Got it. Now, could you just make a quick comment on faster acting aspart and Lumjev? Do we need to do anything different if we use those insulins in our loop system?
There is a custom defined pharmacodynamic curve for FIASP in there.
That's right.
It's honestly just a little bit faster, so it probably doesn't make a huge substantial difference. For Lumjev, same thing. It's a vasodilator made by Lilly, combined with their insulin. So you're going to see sort of perhaps slightly faster than FIASP, but it's not. None of these are to Humalog, Novolog, what Afrezza is to Novolog, Humalog. These aren't like really substantially faster. They're a little bit faster. And can that help you for unannounced meals in Android APS? Yes, there is actually some benefit there if you're doing unannounced meals.
Well, Rayhan, I'll stop and let other people ask questions, but I really rely on Afrezza to help with my highs, and I've been using it, and I wish you guys would fix the algorithm.
Steve, when do you use it? Like, where is your blood sugar, and what have you eaten that makes you take Afrezza, and how much do you take?
Oh man, you want to know what I ate? Oh my God. Well, put it this way, I'm good most of the time, but I would say that when I am, I think we've all been in the boat where you give yourself sub-Q, whether it's through your Omnipod or an old Medtronic pump, and nothing happens. And of course, we all end up getting irritated and stacking the dose, and then you crash. So I would just say when I'm above 200, and I have a trend arrow going up, and in fact, if I'm below 200 with 2 trend arrows going up, you could really help bend the curve by giving yourself a shot of Afrezza. And I usually do 4. Every once in a while, I'll do 8, but everyone's different. And it's been tremendously helpful preventing me from stacking with sub-Q insulin, because Rayhan had that one slide showing, the insulin curves. But, I actually studied looking at IP insulin with the old Medtronic pump in type 2 diabetes. And of course, they had a subgroup of people with type 1. And it is incredible when you give insulin, intraperitoneally. So one of these days we'll either have an advanced sub-Q insulin that has the same pharmacokinetics as intraperitoneal or insulin, but until then, Afrezza really fills an unmet need. And I would say to the person who asked that question in the chat room, I would give it a shot. But like Rayhan said, I I don't know much about these algorithms, and you don't want to mess it up too badly. But just keep an eye on your CGM, and you could probably compensate. If things start going awry, but I've never had a problem.
And I'll add to that, based on what Steve is saying, part of the reason why he's having fewer issues, if you gave it at 200, then you're not going to be falling as substantially than, say, if you used it to correct at 300 or 350 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I get up that high here and there, but typically I just know that I want to get that arrow going diagonal down as soon as I can and avoid stacking with sub-Q. It's really, for me, it's been very helpful. Many of my patients, not all.
Is there a trick to not coughing when you take it in? Do you have a technique?
I'll give you two tricks, because I cough. One is bourbon. No, I'm kidding. I have found that you really need to let the insulin be room temperature. Like if you keep it in your fridge and you say, "Oh shoot, I want to get some," it's not good, because I find that it actually has little clogs because there's some moisture in the fridge. And the second is this. This is probably the single most important, other than room temperature. Inhale slowly. If you go, I'll cough every time, but if you just go, it's still going to get in there, and you'll probably get a good hit, I like to call it. So inhale slowly, and if anybody else has any tips, I know some people they cough every single time. But if you inhale slowly and you make sure it's room temperature, that's a good start.
The other thing I've done is I aim the little pipe up towards the roof of my mouth, so it kind of takes the circuitous route. And I also usually take a drink of water or something before.
It's all stuck on the top of your palate like Wonder Bread now. No wonder it's not working.
Is there anything else coming on the market like Afrezza?
You know what? Not that I know of. I think Lumjev is the most recent. And I don't, if you remember this, that Pfizer had inhaled, Novo had inhaled, Lilly had inhaled. Everyone dropped their program because their rapid on, rapid off wasn't as good as MannKind. And it was really too little too late. And the insurance companies were saying you need to have a needle phobia. And of course, very few people have a true needle phobia. So I do think they may in the future, you never know. But I do think that it's very tough to stay in range if you don't have access to faster acting insulin, unless you just sit around and you're one of these guards at the British Palace and you don't move. No, I'm serious.
A question about Fiasp and Lumjev, and I've tried both, and the additive that they use causes skin irritation. Is there any way they can do this without the irritation?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. So let's think about how they are making the insulin faster in these cases. So in most situations, what are they doing? They're putting in a vasodilator, right? It opens up blood vessels so that the insulin can enter the bloodstream quicker. But when you open up a blood vessel, you also release inflammatory cytokines, stuff that white blood cells make. So it's part and parcel. You at the same time that you increase the exposure of the vessel to the insulin, you also expose the infusion site to all of the white blood cell inflammatory components that are in the blood. So it sort of gets to be eventually a no-win situation, particularly if you're a person where infusion sets don't last a long time.
Yeah, it's I've had other patients with skin rashes too, and for the most part, people tell me they notice a big difference when they first start taking it, but then after a while they don't notice the difference anymore. So, I mean, kudos to Novo and Lilly for trying to advance, the insulin preparations, but just really not there yet.
Yeah, I have a question because I've seen a lot of research about microneedle insulin pumps that are integrated with CGMs, and it seems like all a dream to me. But are you familiar with any of that? And do you know where that stands?
So this is a great question that brings up sort of the speed of insulins and where they're administered. So, you know, if you inject into a vein, obviously that's going to be the fastest. If you inject into either the peritoneum or what we call the intradermal space, this is the small area right below the skin surface, you actually see a significant increase in the speeds of insulin activity. The peritoneum has the additional benefit that the liver acts as a predictive low glucose suspend. So if you are insulin resistant, more insulin passes through unfiltered, whereas if you are insulin sensitive, you may get degradation of the insulin. But this intradermal space is an interesting one because you have hopefully not only low sensor latency, but also low lag in insulin activity with existing insulins.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because there was a good friend of mine, if anybody knows Tom Connect, he did his fellowship at UCSD, he's got type 1, and right in the middle of conference, if his blood sugar was really high, he'd get out a needle, he'd clean off his vein, I got big veins, you know, right here, and he would inject the insulin in his vein. And of course it worked like that. But please don't do that, because you get an infection in your bloodstream. That's not good. And you can get sick. It can wreck your heart valves. It's just not worth it. And if you remember, Rayhan does a company in town. I forgot the stuff they mix the insulin with, and it somehow, they put it, you had to use it in your insulin pump, and it allowed better pharmacokinetics. I'm blanking on that now, Rayhan, if you remember that. And they gave up on that development. So people are looking at it. And, you know, if you go to a place in France, I do believe, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, Rayhan, Dr. Montelier is still putting in the implantable insulin pump where the catheter goes into what we call the peritoneum, and it gets sucked up into your portal vein. Works very quickly, but you know, this pump is pretty big and you got to refill it through the skin. You got to be careful. I'm thinking of the Desotronic
That's right.
Diaport too. Anyway, I think that one last thing I want to say, and I don't want to hog the mic, is that what you said about the people in the DCCT, that people who had a time in range of 44% did not develop microvascular complications. I mean, I don't get that. I mean, I'm happy for that. I'm really happy about that, but it seems like, why are we saying 70? Because we can do 45 with our eyes closed. Because we can still fit donuts in our mouth with our eyes closed.
And I will add, so that analysis was trying to extrapolate a TIR from those, you know, they did the 7-point tests back in the day. So they were extrapolating time and ranges from that. So obviously there can be some calculation error, but I do want to make the point that if you are running at a time and range, you know, over 75%, you are better controlled than anybody in that trial that proved that high blood sugar led to complications. So I know that there is this continual push to go to the next big thing, move to something else, but do keep in mind that there is a point where you are doing good enough. Give yourself a pat on the back and do the things you really want to be doing.
I think that's such a great point, because you know, I get in competition with Jeremy and I'm killing myself to stay in range, you know, and finally I just say F it, you know. Okay, I'm going to go down to 85 today. So what?
You will live, Steve. You will live.
Okay, a few more questions and then we'll let you guys have dinner. Question for you, Rayhan, are there studies at Stanford that we can participate in related to insulin absorption issues and other Stanford research?
Oh, most certainly. So what I will do is I will send out, maybe Joanne, if you could distribute amongst the group, there is a diabetes research registry. So if you enter some baseline demographics, then we can contact you for any relevant studies that might be fitting with your profile.
That sounds great. I keep wanting to make one more question, but I've got three. What numbers are considered in range? What are the top and bottom numbers for those studies?
70 to 180 is the international consensus for time in range.
We actually asked an endocrinologist in Orange County, why 180?
It's a great question. A lot of this came from, okay, so it is important to note that this is expert opinion first. So it's not like somebody ran, multiple regressions and did lots of fancy math to try to figure this out. There had been prior studies where sort of 180 was figured to be, okay, this is sort of where we expect maybe normal blood sugars in individuals to peak at. And so using that and the fact that, hey, we've used this in some prior closed loop studies, a lot of people came to this conclusion that, hey, 180 seems like a reasonable upper limit, and 70, I think for a lot of us, we remember the days when 60 was a low blood sugar. The way I look at it now, it's forgive the Star Trek analogy, but 70 is sort of the yellow alert. And so, this is one of those things where what we can say is that your time in range in that 70 to 180 correlates very well with A1C. So a 2-week time in range is a good measure. It correlates with A1C, and A1C is what we have traditionally always associated with outcomes. So it is a pretty good metric.
I'll just add one quick thing is that if you look at major organizations before time and range came out, the goal for your blood sugar after eating is 180. And most of the studies we do, hypoglycemia is considered below 70. So that probably had something to do with the guidelines as well.
That's great.
So it's pre and post.
Okay.
Well, I'll just say that in general, hypoglycemia, the kind that we get on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, has never been shown to cause neurologic damage. Never. Now, if you get so low, you pass out and you're unconscious for hours, that could cause damage and it could kill you. But the kind of lows that we get on a daily basis really doesn't. And of course, everybody has their own limit. Some people feel terrible at 70. So make your level 80. And it could also allow you to bust in and ask crazy questions during one of these programs. So it's possible you've gotten low too many times, man. Okay.
Thank you.
That's complicated stuff, Rayhan.
This has been extraordinary. Thank you so much for your time, for the work you do for all of us. It's really makes my heart really happy. Thank you. If other people have questions, you can throw it in SoCal Loopers. I will edit the video and it should be up tomorrow on the YouTube channel. And my gosh, thank you.
Yeah, feel free to send me any questions, my email. And I think I have a much greater respect for what goes into these algorithms. For many of us, we just say, hey, you get your friend to help set you up. But I think having a deeper understanding allows you to do better. So Rayhan, thank you for helping me from day one. I really appreciate it. And all those 899 other people. Because I don't know, you don't get any sleep because I know you're always helping everybody at every time. So I appreciate it.
As I always say, I just went into this to help my brothers and sisters with diabetes. So that's what I'm here for.
Well, we think
same offer from Steve.
We think we're
email
part of your family. We're part of your family now. We are your brothers and sisters as well. So there you go. Thank you, everybody. Have a good dinner if it's dinner time for you. Really appreciate the time.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you.